This wasn't innovation. It wasn't strategy, it was abandonment, a gut punch to the very people who built these brands into American legends. Overnight, production lines went silent, exports stalled, fuel demand nosedived, and the ripple effect? It's hitting your dinner plate, your paycheck, and your future. John Deere once powered the fields. Ford once built the roads. Now, both are outsourcing the soul of American labor and calling it efficiency. But behind the boardroom buzzwords is a different story. Rising food costs, collapsing rural economies, and an economy teetering on the edge. So here's the question. Why are farms going bankrupt while John Deere spends billions on robots? Why is Ford outsourcing EVs while pretending to lead an American future? And why are food prices, job losses, and oil disruptions all hitting at the same time? The answer is buried deep inside this story, and by the end, it may change how you see every American brand you thought you could trust. Ford's secret exit plan. Ford didn't announce it, they leaked it, knowing full well it would ignite a firestorm. The decision to shift large portions of electric vehicle manufacturing overseas wasn't delivered with fanfare. It slipped out through investor briefings and quiet memos. By the time the public found out, it was too late. The jobs were already gone. Electric vehicles had been hailed as the future, cleaner, smarter, and the foundation of the next great American industrial era. But behind the scenes, Ford executives were struggling. Supply chain costs were soaring. Demand was stalling. Access to key battery materials like lithium and cobalt was becoming a high-stakes international scramble. And so the company made its move. Parts of production were relocated to countries with cheaper labor, friendlier mining policies, and fewer environmental restrictions. For Ford, it was about survival. For the American workforce, it was a direct hit. The betrayal felt even deeper given the timing. Just months earlier, Ford had secured favorable terms in labor negotiations, promising jobs and stability in exchange for union flexibility. Now, those promises felt hollow. The United Auto Workers began to mobilize. Internal memos from plants in Michigan and Ohio circulated with warnings of layoffs. Workers who had spent decades on the line were left wondering what came next. This quiet offshoring maneuver wasn't just a business decision, it was a political powder keg. The administration quickly took notice. And at the center of it all stood a man who had built his entire brand around economic patriotism. His retaliation came swiftly. But before we get into the details, subscribe. It's free and easy. Thanks. Trump's warpath. At a rally that drew tens of thousands, he blasted both Ford and John Deere for abandoning the American worker. His voice thundered through the crowd as he promised a 200% tariff on any vehicle or agricultural equipment manufactured outside the United States and brought back for sale. He called it corporate betrayal. He called it economic treason. And for many watching, it struck a chord. This wasn't abstract policy debate. This was personal. Communities that had voted for protection, for revival, for American-made pride, now saw their champions packing up for cheaper shores. Within hours, markets responded. Ford stock dipped. Deere shares followed. Analysts scrambled to forecast what such aggressive trade action might do to global supply chains. Would automakers reroute operations? Would farm equipment costs skyrocket? No one had answers, only panic. Ford executives tried to calm the storm. Deere issued vague press statements about global competitiveness. Neither company addressed the emotional backlash that was spreading across the country. Their silence only added fuel to the fire. Media coverage exploded. Political commentators from both parties weighed in. Some praised the boldness of Trump's move. Others warned it could backfire, triggering a trade war that would leave more jobs lost and prices soaring. Still, the message was clear. The United States government would not sit quietly while its industrial heart was hollowed out. What started as corporate strategy had now become a national crisis, and the people, the ones with dirt under their nails and grease on their hands, had finally had enough. Workers, farmers, and dealers turn on American giants. Boycotts, strikes, and protests. America's backbone just snapped. From rural townships in Iowa to union halls in Detroit, the resistance began. It was not organized at first. A farmer canceled a Deere tractor order. A Ford technician walked off the job. A dealership hung an American flag upside down in protest. Small acts of defiance that grew louder by the day. Soon it was coordinated. Farmers across the Midwest held joint rallies, refusing to buy new equipment until John Deere reversed its decision. Local unions staged walkouts. Dealership networks filed lawsuits against Ford, accusing the company of sabotaging its own domestic sales model. The backlash moved fast. It spilled into school board meetings, state legislatures, and onto the floor of Congress. American workers were no longer silent. They demanded answers, respect, and jobs. This was no longer a debate about trade policy. It was a full-blown rebellion. People who had been the bedrock of American productivity felt discarded. Their response? Rage, then resistance. And that fury? It reached the ears of someone else across the Pacific. The China shift. How Beijing turned U.S. farming into a fossil. America built the farm. China built the future. In the battle for global agricultural dominance, one player has emerged as an unstoppable force: China. As American farmers and manufacturers scrambled to keep pace, China quietly invested in self-sufficiency, forever altering the dynamics of global trade. The result: the United States no longer stands at the helm of agricultural power. Instead, China has transformed from a food importer to a formidable agricultural powerhouse. It wasn't a sudden shift. China's government recognized that relying on foreign imports would always leave them vulnerable, and so they acted decisively. Investments in modern farming technologies, precision irrigation, genetically modified crops, and state-of-the-art harvesting equipment allowed China to ramp up domestic production. They weren't just growing more crops, they were growing them more efficiently, with fewer resources. This shift in agricultural power hit the U.S. economy harder than expected. In the past, China's reliance on American-grown crops had been a major revenue source for U.S. farmers. But now, with China's booming agricultural industry producing its own goods at a fraction of the cost, U.S. exports have sharply declined. China's aggressive investment in farming technology wasn't just an economic move, it was a strategic one. As global markets grappled with the political tensions of trade wars and shifting alliances, China took the long view. They no longer needed American agricultural goods. They had the resources and technology to meet their own food demands, and in doing so, they shifted the balance of global agricultural markets entirely. The ripple effects were felt across the U.S. agricultural sector. With fewer crops being sold overseas, prices began to plummet. Farmers, already struggling with rising operational costs and shifting market dynamics, found themselves in a dire situation. With China no longer a reliable buyer of U.S. goods, they were forced to look for new markets, if they could find them. And the price of that shift? You'll feel it in the grocery aisle. The day U.S. agriculture lost $34 billion in value. Corn collapsed, wheat plummeted, soy desaparecido. The U.S. agricultural industry, once the undisputed leader in global crop production, faced a financial disaster of monumental proportions. In just one devastating season, the value of American crops dropped by over $34 billion. It wasn't just a blip in the market, it was a full-scale collapse. The cause? An unrelenting combination of falling global demand, economic shifts in international trade, and the catastrophic rise of China's self-sufficient agricultural model. The numbers were staggering. U.S. farmers, already struggling to cope with inflation and rising material costs, suddenly found their crops worthless. Corn prices fell by more than 37%. Soybeans and wheat followed, each suffering massive losses in value. What had once been a thriving export market was now in free fall, and for farmers, the financial consequences were immediate and devastating. The emotional toll on America's agricultural workers was palpable. The farms they'd dedicated their lives to, the land that had been passed down through generations, was now worthless. Families that had relied on agriculture to provide a livelihood watched in horror as their entire financial foundation crumbled beneath them. Bankruptcy filings surged as farmers who had once been the backbone of America's economy were now staring down the barrel of financial ruin. As the domestic crop market imploded, American farmers found themselves caught in a perfect storm. With trade disruptions, shrinking demand from abroad, and an ever-tightening labor market, survival became a distant dream for many. The U.S. agricultural sector, once the envy of the world, was on the brink of collapse. The bleeding didn't stop there, because automation hit next. Automation Nation. John Deere's gamble on robots over people. Deere didn't just fire workers, they replaced them with machines. In an era where efficiency was the name of the game, John Deere made a bold and ultimately controversial decision. As crop prices continued to fall and consumer demand for farm equipment dropped, Deere turned to automation, betting on robots to replace the very people who had once been the heart of their workforce. Deere's push for autonomous tractors and precision farming tools wasn't just about staying competitive, it was about survival. The company, facing mounting losses and a shrinking customer base, decided that labor costs were their biggest obstacle to long-term success. As a result, they invested heavily in autonomous equipment that could work the fields without human intervention. This move was revolutionary and devastating. As Deere continued to automate its machinery, a deep divide began to form between the corporate farms that could afford these advanced machines and the small family-owned farms that had been left behind. For corporate giants, Deere's high-tech tractors represented a new era of efficiency and profitability. For smaller farmers, however, the new machinery was far too expensive, creating an insurmountable barrier to entry. As Deere's push for automation accelerated, the effects on America's labor force were stark. Thousands of workers who had spent decades on the factory floor were suddenly made obsolete. The promise of higher productivity through robotics came at the steep price of human livelihoods. Farmers, too, were feeling the squeeze. The very technology that was meant to solve their problems, automating labor-intensive tasks like planting and harvesting, was now pricing them out of the market. Those who had once invested in Deere's legendary equipment found themselves caught in a vicious cycle. The cost of upgrading to automated machines was simply too high, and as their profits dwindled, their ability to pay for new equipment became impossible. And just as farmers were priced out, labor vanished entirely. The Immigration Shutdown. How Trump's policy starved American farms. Crops were ready. No one was left to harvest them. The labor crisis facing U.S. agriculture worsened significantly under the Trump administration's immigration policies. With over 70% of farm workers in the United States being immigrants, the sharp reduction in available labor had a devastating impact on harvests across the country. As the White House doubled down on strict immigration enforcement, farm owners found themselves scrambling to fill positions in the fields. Harvests were left to rot in the ground, unable to be picked by the limited workforce available. What had once been an efficient and relatively inexpensive labor force was now evaporating, leaving American farms on the brink of collapse. The comparison to the labor crisis of 2018 was unmistakable. Then, as now, the agricultural sector found itself reeling from labor shortages, and the consequences were equally severe. With fewer workers to harvest crops, the cost of labor skyrocketed, and the supply chain began to crack under the pressure. The economic impact was immediate. The cost of food, already rising due to the collapse in crop prices, began to climb even higher as farms struggled to meet production targets. The prices that consumers paid at the grocery store reflected the strain in the system, with basic goods becoming increasingly expensive and harder to find. With farms gutted, attention turned to the oil fueling them, the oil freeze. It wasn't just jobs, they shut down the oil too. At the core of the crisis, two American giants, Ford and John Deere, quietly pulled the plug on a critical element of U.S. industry, its energy lifeline. By shifting operations overseas and slashing domestic production, they triggered an energy supply disaster that no one saw coming. Diesel prices skyrocketed as fuel demands shifted unpredictably. For truckers, the backbone of American transportation, and farmers, the lifeblood of food production, fuel became an unreachable luxury. The collapse was swift, a domino effect starting with diesel shortages and spiraling into logistical paralysis. Farmers who once relied on Deere's heavy machinery to plow fields and harvest crops now found themselves unable to afford or access fuel to run those very machines. Truckers, dependent on reliable fuel to move goods across the country, saw their costs explode. The ripple effects reached every corner of the supply chain, causing a slow, painful collapse in industries that depend on transportation and logistics. The very industry that had once powered American agriculture and trade now stood still. The ripple effects were felt in city streets and small towns alike. What had begun as a move to cut costs became an anchor dragging down the entire American economy. As oil supplies dried up, prices surged uncontrollably, sending inflation into overdrive. For middle-class families, fuel costs became the latest blow in an already tumultuous time. Energy prices would no longer be predictable, only volatile. With truckers and farmers unable to keep up, the nation's critical infrastructure began to crack. And when oil stopped flowing, Wall Street started panicking. Investors, already shaken by Ford's move to offshoring, now saw an even deeper problem, an energy crisis that could decimate profits across the board. Corporate strategies built on cheap fuel and low labor costs suddenly looked outdated. The stock market reacted accordingly, and every major sector that relied on transportation and fuel began to tremble. Now, I am going to reveal how, but first, take a moment to hit subscribe. You will be helping us a lot. The market shock that no one predicted. In 48 hours, oil markets lost $166.6 billion. The sudden disappearance of fuel created a global market shock. This wasn't just about oil prices spiking. It was about a seismic event in the world's financial systems. With U.S. energy production and consumption in crisis, the flow of capital shifted as well. Fossil fuel contracts that had once guaranteed stability now became worthless. The sudden volatility rattled even the most robust economies, as energy markets and industries tied to transportation reeled in disbelief. The crisis spread quickly as banks adjusted their forecasts and investors scrambled to mitigate risk. The sheer magnitude of the collapse sent shockwaves across the market, wiping out billions in stock value almost overnight. Industries dependent on cheap energy, manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, found their future growth potential evaporating in real time. The impact was not just financial but psychological. The American economy had been built on the reliability of cheap energy. Without it, everything felt uncertain. Adding to the panic, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which had been the country's safety net for decades, was suddenly considered insufficient to meet the growing demand. What had been a symbol of security now felt like an ill-prepared response to an urgent crisis. The hope of a quick fix dissipated as the reality of the situation set in. Energy companies scrambled to adjust, but their plans too were stymied by global supply chain disruptions. The world's economy was now facing a true crossroads. Either the energy market would stabilize through international cooperation, or the market would fracture, creating a new world order of competition for dwindling resources. The cracks in the system began to show. While investors and markets panicked, the White House, still dealing with the aftershocks of Trump's economic nationalism, seized the opportunity to shift focus. Economic wars were now the primary battlefield, and those in the government who had long advocated for a more aggressive stance in global trade saw their opening. The White House readied its response. Plans for retaliatory tariffs on oil imports were drafted, hoping to mitigate the damage and stabilize U.S. energy reliance. Tariff Earthquake. One executive decision triggered a global trade war. The White House's response was swift and decisive. Donald Trump, never one to back down from a trade fight, declared tariffs on both auto and agricultural imports. His strategy hit Ford and John Deere where it would hurt the most. By imposing steep tariffs on companies that moved production overseas, Trump hoped to send a message that American industry would not be undermined without consequence. In essence, these tariffs would force companies like Ford, Deere, and their foreign competitors to rethink their strategies. If foreign goods were subject to high tariffs, manufacturers would have no choice but to return jobs and operations to the U.S. The consequences of this tariff retaliation were immediate. Countries around the world, many of them key U.S. allies, quickly responded with their own counter-tariffs. The European Union and Canada, major trading partners, voiced strong opposition. The conflict escalated quickly as countries saw Trump's move as an affront to global trade and cooperation. This wasn't just about Ford or Deere. It was about the future of U.S. manufacturing and the shift away from cooperative international trade agreements. The world's trading rules were now up for renegotiation, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. In the U.S., manufacturing industries faced uncertainty. What had once been a stable environment for trade was now a battlefield, where no company could predict which markets would remain open or closed. The tariff war threatened to undo decades of progress. The vulture's circle. Ford's EV market. As Ford collapsed, Tesla and China came to feast. The decision to offload electric vehicle production overseas opened a door that Ford had never intended to open. As the company's reputation deteriorated, Tesla pounced, positioning itself as the only truly American-made electric vehicle brand. Elon Musk, Tesla's CEO, saw this as a unique opportunity to stake his claim in the EV market. By expanding U.S. production, Tesla was able to capitalize on the growing backlash against Ford. Musk's PR strategy turned the narrative to his advantage, painting Ford as a company willing to abandon its roots in pursuit of profit. Meanwhile, China's BYD, a global EV powerhouse, quietly took over markets that Ford had once dominated. BYD's ability to scale its production with lower labor costs, access to cheaper batteries, and an increasingly globalized market allowed them to eclipse Ford's market share. While the U.S. struggled with a failed strategy and rising consumer dissatisfaction, China's automotive industry marched ahead, undeterred by tariffs or trade wars. The EV race was on, but America was falling behind. For Ford, the consequences were dire: loss of market share, shrinking brand perception, and a deteriorating public image combined to create a perfect storm. The company's once strong position in the market now seemed tenuous. Perception, a powerful force in the auto industry, was shifting away from Ford in favor of Tesla and the increasingly successful Chinese manufacturers. Ford, once the symbol of American innovation, now faced the challenge of survival in an industry that was rapidly moving past it. And just when things couldn't look worse, the land started to burn. Burned to the ground. Fields flooded, crops scorched, seasons reversed. It was never supposed to be this way. America's farmlands, once the envy of the world, are now on the front lines of a global crisis. As if corporate betrayal and economic collapse weren't enough, the very environment that once nurtured crops has turned against the U.S. agricultural system. Climate change isn't a distant threat. It's here, and it's wreaking havoc. Droughts, floods, and wildfires are no longer rare events. They are regular and increasingly brutal. Farmers in the Midwest now face the nightmare of entire seasons lost to parched soil. What was once fertile ground is now cracked and dry, unable to sustain the crops that fed generations of families. On the opposite end, the East Coast has become a battleground for unpredictable storms, leaving fields submerged in floodwaters. As the weather patterns shift unpredictably, what used to be predictable seasons have become an annual guessing game. Farmers no longer know if their crops will survive. It's not just a change in weather, it's a change in how we live. The once reliable rhythm of planting and harvest has been disrupted, and with it, the livelihoods of millions. The economic damage is staggering. Insurance costs skyrocket, as does the price of farming inputs, including water and fertilizers. Farmers who had already been squeezed by rising equipment costs and falling crop prices now face an environmental assault that seems unstoppable. The perfect storm is here: climate change, rising debt, and an agricultural system that has been eroded by decades of outsourcing and corporate neglect. America's farming economy is crumbling under the weight of environmental instability. Farmers are losing hope, and with that, the identity of rural America is at stake. The very landscape that once represented strength and independence is now on its knees, unable to withstand the forces of nature and corporate greed. And yet, amid this chaos, there was one last pillar left standing, until it wasn't. The death of the small farm. One farm dies every 36 minutes. The heart of America, the small family farm, is slipping away. And it's not just an economic tragedy, it's a cultural one. What was once the backbone of the United States, a source of pride, independence, and self-reliance, is now rapidly disappearing. The numbers tell a grim story. In just the last several decades, the number of small family farms has dwindled by more than half. The land that was once passed down through generations now finds itself sold to corporate conglomerates and hedge funds. The rise of corporate farming has been swift and brutal. Large-scale agricultural operations, with their vast resources and automated machinery, have outcompeted the small farms that once defined America's agricultural landscape. These corporate giants, driven by profit margins and economies of scale, have no use for the small, independent farmer. The result? The countryside, once dotted with family-run farms, now stands barren, except for the corporate monoliths that control everything from seed to sale. What's left in the wake of this transformation? Communities decimated, identity shattered. The soul of rural America is being erased, one farm at a time. For generations, farming wasn't just a job, it was a way of life. A heritage that connected families to the land and to each other. Now that way of life is disappearing, replaced by faceless, automated operations that care more about profit than people. The collapse of the small farm isn't just an economic issue, it's a cultural death sentence. The unique rhythm of rural life, the community-centered approach to agriculture, is being replaced by a corporate-driven, industrialized system that has little regard for the people who built it. Small towns that once thrived on the energy of their farms are now struggling to survive. Local businesses that depended on farm labor and farmers' earnings are closing, and unemployment is rising in communities that were once vibrant with the pulse of agricultural work. If we think technology can save us from this destruction, think again. Automation, artificial intelligence, and corporate consolidation might boost efficiency, but they will never replace the heart of America. As the small farm dies, so too does the very identity that made this country strong. The death of the family farm isn't just an agricultural crisis, it's a national crisis. What happens when the backbone of America is broken? What happens when the identity of a nation is lost in the fields? Let's know your thoughts down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I will see you there.